Hi, so Elementalists really got a lot of attention after the patch notes, especially with the buffs to golems. So I just kind of want to talk about what I see from an Ignite perspective. So first of all, an anti-bait. I know that I'm probably the 1000th person to talk about Ignite, Elementalist, and Golem buffs, but it is buffed. However, I still don't think is as strong as stuff like Slayer, Trickster, Juggernaut, even after the Trickster nerfs. And that's just because those ascendancies are so strong in terms of solving either defense or recovery. And I think if you're aiming for just straight up, what's the most powerful thing you can play, it's probably still one of those three. With that being said, I think there is some cool stuff that's going on. So the first and I think the biggest change is the enemies have 40% of their physical damage converted to fire when you ignite them. And I think this is really important. And this is kind of overlooked. Some people are saying is a nerf. I definitely think is a buff, and that's because elementalists and a lot of the top side witch builds just traditionally have really poor fizz mitigation, and this would help solve that by quite a bit. In terms of golems, obviously the golems got buffed. You have the two nodes that now become one node, so it's a lot more efficient also. And I do think we'll be taking golems in almost every elementalist build. In terms of stuff you can play on this build, there's the classic Frostblink and Fire Trap setup for League Start, or Wave of Conviction and Vault Flame Blast. Of the two, I think the Wave of Conviction Vault Flame Blast probably works better because you just get huge damage with Vault Flame Blast, and the Wave of Conviction is very efficient because it's both your clear skill and it applies the exposure debuff. In terms of, there's a lot of different builds you can play. In the end game, you can transition to any of these. There's some more experimental ones, like maybe you can run Righteous Fire once you get explosions. Vol Reap got buffed. Burning Arrow life stacking got buffed. Maw of Mischief, I don't know so much about this one because even though it was one of the strongest ignites in Settlers, I don't know how you can blow up the Spectres without blowing up the Golems. So you might not be able to benefit from the Golem buffs as much. So one of the biggest problems with Elementalist, and this is why it was not very smooth to League started previously, is always the defenses. It's historically been just an ascendancy with a bunch of offense, but there's not a lot of defense. There's not a lot of fizz mitigation. You're on the top side of the tree, and CI is not usually something you consider on day one or day two. So I would say if you're looking at any POB starter builds out of maps, you should have 2.5k life and 75 capped Ellie res. Um, and either Grace or Determination, you should either go one or the other, maybe both if you can squeeze it in and have the stat. If I see any POB that's without either Grace or Determination and is on life build, I would say a spade. You're gonna die to white mobs hitting you in tier 2, 3 maps. Entering red maps, so this is when you'd want either when you'd actually want your rare items to not be random stuff off the ground and start being things that benefit the stuff you're building on your tree. So things like evasion armor rolls on your armor, you're gonna want either jade or granite flask depending on which direction you're going in. You're gonna want a little bit of life regen. This is either through reserving vitality or on your gear, and it complements the stone golem. And the reason is because Elementalist, as a kind of build without attacking quite a bit, without the leech, you're going to be kind of wanting that life regeneration to smooth out the gameplay. So life regen is actually quite important. And finally, non-negative chaos res, because this is when chaos res really starts to hurt. After Exarch and Eater, so when you're doing more juiced maps, T16 maps, you're going to want some multi-hit mitigation. So if you get hit rapidly, if you get shotgun, for example, you're not just going to die on the spot. You're going to want block or spell suppression. You're going to want some sort of recovery when you get hit. So that could be, for example, like life gain on block on your shield. And finally, if you're not going a large amount of armor, so if you're not spec'd into a large amount of armor, you're going to want fist taken as elemental. For example, you're going to want like Cloak of Flame, Lightning Coil, stuff like that, just to make sure you don't get killed by physical damage outright. So in the end game, there's a bunch of choices here. Feel free to pause the video if you want to like take a look at stuff. This is normally things you don't really have to think about on classes like Trickster, where you just get a lot of energy shield and it kind of solves all your problems. But on Elementalist, you really do have to do a lot of thinking, like how am I going to solve defenses? So for big physical hits, Enduring Composure, always a good bet on your Cluster Jewel. In terms of big elemental hits, usually I don't think the threat level of this is too high. These are usually like big boss slams that you're supposed to dodge anyways. But if you want to get tougher in terms of in this direction, Divine Flesh, always a good choice. And also just specking into more maximum resistances on the tree. I think multi-hit, this is what, when I was leveling my last character to 98, I think this is what killed me the most, is just basically getting shotgunned by a bunch of random stuff that's like off-screen, screaming bats, cannibals, stuff like that. So you want either a lot of armor or evasion. These really help against small, frequent hits, and then some sort of like life gain when you get hit mechanic, like Defiance of Destiny or life gain on block. And finally, damage over time. This does kill you. Some maps have really big degens, like Silo Boss, Plaza Boss, the thing that floats behind the Zaro, that thing. And for these, you just want to have, I guess the best way is to have life and ES pool be higher with some regeneration or recharge. You can also get different types of immunities to ailments from pantheons or from any other sort of mechanics. So one interesting mechanic about Ignite that is kind of unique to this ailment is Proliferation. So Proliferation is when you kill an enemy, it leaves kind of this patch of damage on the ground, and that kind of helps you zone out enemies sometimes. So some people also equip Barracks Respite or Aberrath Hooves, but this is another type of Proliferation. This is a type of chaining proliferation, and these do not work together. So if you have both of these, if you have Ignite Prolif and Barracks Respite at the same time, it's only going to be Ignite Prolif. Your Barracks will be useless. So just to make sure that if you are thinking of going down the path of you're using the Barracks Respite, that you unequip Ignite Prolif in your main link. There's another way to kind of improve your mapping speed, and this is my favorite way, I think, and it's with Explosions plus Global Proliferation. So what this means is that instead of using the Ignite Proliferation support on your main skill, you're going to use a global proliferation source. This could either be Fan the Flames Cluster Jewel, or I think there's a similar thing on the glove mod. I think it's Exarch, it might be Eater. I'm not 100% sure right now. With that plus explosion, so what happens is that when it explodes, the explosion actually ignites and it would leave a proliferation, and the proliferation can cause other enemies to ignite and they'll explode. So this would cause a chain reaction that also leaves a bunch of damaging ground around you to zone out enemies. And I think this is probably the smoothest way to play Ignite. And this is always, like Ori Ascend is always a core item that I aim for. So when you're league starting, you might not have best access to the weapons. But if you're playing Trade League and maybe you're in maps a bit later because you just play casually, these are going to be pretty cheap on like day 2, day 3. Stuff like Singularity is a good damage source. Obliteration is good if you're going Fizz Conversion, for example, Wave of Conviction. Golem buffs. All right, so I'm going to talk about Golem buffs. So there are some really remarkable stuff here. I think, of course, AoE on Flame is really cool. The global defenses on Stone, you can use it on pretty much any build, I think. And then I think Lightning and Ice, this really depends on what you're thinking of running. 18 flat mana regen is really helpful when you're using some sort of like casting heavy build, because a lot of these builds, a lot of the LA caster builds, they would go Eldritch Battery, and that's because they just run out of mana. But if you have the 18 flat mana regen, that really helps you smooth out the casting experience without having to go Eldritch Battery. And then Ice is just, the flat accuracy is great. And I think if you're playing something attack-based, like Explosive Ballista, Explosive Arrow Ballista, you would not need to spec into accuracy as much as you did before, which is really good. With the Ascendancy node and Golem Commander, of course, you get much more benefit from this, and you can feel free to pause the video to look at some of these, but it's really nuts, especially Ice Golem. I think if you're going attack build, you would instantly be accuracy capped. You wouldn't have to think about like RT or anything like that. You can scale this even further. There's some jewels, Primordial Eminence, and then there's the large cluster jewel notable called Primordial Bond, and these are both stackable. You can also add quality to it by using Enhance and Ashes of the Stars. One more thing is, I don't know if I'm worried about nothing right now. I haven't tried this so much, but keeping your golems alive, you might want to take some minion life nodes on the tree with also these two clusters, Sacrifice and Spiritual Aid. They both have minions regenerate a percentage of their life, which I think will really make the uptime a lot better during mapping situations. You're going to run defensive auras. I think, once again, either Determination or Grace or both, because your golems will only be taking physical and chaos damage, and I think the more threatening of the two is physical damage. Okay, finally, okay, bonus one. If you are not thinking of running a shield, you can buy Searing Touch. This is usually 2C on day 2, maybe even 1C. And then Rebuke of the Vault is a great sword you can use with Spellblade to really beef up any sort of big ignite hits like Vol Flame Blast and stuff like that, just to add a ton of flat damage to anything that scales well with it. And yeah, that's all. Happy blasting.